In 10 years from now, we are going to have a small army of autonomous robots building a human domicile on the surface of Mars. Mark my words, that is my prediction. Friends, I have never been wrong in any of my predictions in the past. Of course, ditch digging and car driving robots, they're already among us. No big deal. The real question is, how will they be as friends and lovers? Today on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, we will be looking at social robots, and in particular the question of whether human beings can actually form friendships with robots. It's very curious stuff. There's a lot of research coming out on this now, and I want to share a little bit of that research with you. We know a lot more about how human beings bond. We know a lot more about what the brain is doing and the endocrine system and all that, and it's kind of helpful in terms of understanding our very near future with robot friends and lovers. Oh yeah, it's in your future. It's not your grandchildren, it's probably going to be in your future. So welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. Boom, we're in. Social robots are already with us. There's a few of them that have been made in Japan recently. One is a sort of what they call a zoomorph, which is in the shape of an animal, and its name is Paro. It's a cute little bugger. It's basically like a baby seal. It's furry, it's got, eyes that move, it makes noises, it sort of squiggles around. And they did a bunch of investigations with Paro. And Paro, in sort of an elder community, was extremely effective at lowering stress and anxiety among the patients, among the elderly there. It also increased their social interactions with each other. It seemed to have some impact on depression. So even though it's just a very simple social robot, even that turns out to have some health benefits. There's also another one that was made by the Japanese called Telenoid. I recommend you look it up because it is terrifying. It is like a baby with no arms and legs. I really don't know what they were thinking. It's kind of utterly frightening. And that's Telenoid. It also has like sort of speech and it can move a little bit. And some of these actually get warm when you touch them. And then there's another one created by the University of Toronto called Brian. Brian the social robot. He is also terrifying looking, and I think if they're trying to reduce anxiety, they really need to do a better job with Brian and Telenoid. It puts me in mind of the great Hitchbot, which you may have heard of. Again, this was a robot that was designed by a couple of Canadian researchers, and it got famous in 2013. Kind of a stationary, it moves a little bit, but it doesn't have legs. It's not autonomous in that way, but it can talk a little bit and it lights up and it has some behaviors. They set it up in Canada. They notified people they were doing this, and it would be on the side of the road. And so a driver would pick it up and basically like drive it down the road, talking to it and interacting with it, and then drop it off somewhere. And then another driver would do the same. And it basically hitchhiked across Canada, and then it hitchhiked across Germany, and it hitchhiked across the Netherlands. And then they tried it in America, in the United States in 2015, and it was dismembered and decapitated in Philadelphia, like within days of its actual adventure. So welcome to America, Hitchbot. It gives one pause because you can't help but imagine what kind of abuse social robots will take. Not just by Americans, but by anybody that has a sadistic streak in them. Because if you can build a robot that's essentially, that looks humanoid and behaves humanoid, but there's nobody home, think about all the horrible things you could do to it. Anyway, one question I have for you, curiosifers, is do you think you could form a real friendship with a robot? Or do you think that's impossible? Whatever that would be, it would not be real friendship. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I will read them and reply. I think it's a fascinating question, what we think we're capable of befriending and or torturing. Weird. So what are the ways that social robots can help us? One is, imagine you could have a robot buddy that's your exercise buddy who works out with you. Or how about a physical therapy buddy? You've had an injury and you need physical therapy, and the robot is there to help you do the exercises and to kind of keep you going and keep you on task. Social robots also seem to show promising results with dementia patients and Alzheimer's patients. They seem to be good at aiding people who are having memory troubles and even taking care of basic bodily needs. Imagine if you had a robot buddy that was like you could program it so that it was a joke-telling chess partner. So you could play chess with this thing and it's riffing like W.C. Fields or something. That's got to uplift your mood. So there's indications that social robots can improve your positive affect or your positive emotions. And then finally, imagine a totally non-judgmental sexual partner robot. That sounds nice. This question of how you would interact with a robot is something that, the late 19th century was very interested in, and science fiction has been playing with this idea for decades. And if you think about sort of the era of industrialization, Karl Marx, Kafka, they were very much interested in the phenomenon of alienation. We're sort of alienated from our labor and the products of our labor because we work in, as wage slaves maybe in factories. And so that whole discussion was happening in the 19th century, but also it influenced sort of psychology of alienation. Are we estranged from each other? Does our sort of utilitarian life reduce our human connection? And I think the social robot thing is continuing this argument in a way, maybe making it even more pressing than ever. There's a wonderful philosopher that comes out of this period named Martin Buber, and he looks at human cognition and he says, human beings seem to treat the world in one of two ways. I'm an I, or a subject, and as a person, you're a thou. So he says there's a kind of I-thou relationship where I see you as potentially an equal, as a person with a personality with hopes and dreams and intentions. And then there's this other mode where he calls it the I-it modality, where I'm the subject, but I see this chair as an it, or I see this table as an it, or my computer is an it. And we can kind of shift between these different modes, I, thou, and I, it, depending on really what we're thinking, what we're feeling. So I can treat an inanimate object like a thou, like a person. In fact, all kids seem to do this. All kids are naturally animists. They think of, a spoon is like a personality and a chair is like, there would be no Walt Disney or Hayao Miyazaki if we weren't sort of inclined towards this animistic view. On the other hand, though, you can treat people and animals, which ordinarily are thous, you can treat them as its. And that's the sort of cause of a lot of modern alienation, where we think of people more like objects or things. And Martin Buber thought this was a sort of unique problem for modern or contemporary human beings. And I think this issue is going to come even stronger as we get more and more comfortable with robots in our daily lives. And if you think about it, this is a kind of a big deal in a lot of science fiction. So you'll see great robots represented in science fiction. I remember first seeing in 2001, that great Stanley Kubrick film, they're shutting off HAL 9000. And HAL 9000 is basically like singing a song. He doesn't want to be shut off, but he's done some pernicious things in the plot. And so our human protagonist has to sort of unplug him through a variety of moves. And as the robot is the computer is basically singing the song, your heart is kind of, it's really strumming on your heartstrings to see this computer basically losing its life. And one wonders, are we projecting personality onto a non-person? Is that a kind of anthropomorphic projection? Or are we sort of recognizing a conscious being because it's linguistically sophisticated? It's a very interesting question. And of course, movies like Her are asking us to think this through. And then you don't even need these movies. There's stories coming out in the news about younger people in particular bonding with AI, like chatbots, and then actually doing what the chatbots are suggesting or forging a kind of emotional bond. And some of this is pretty scary. The reason why I think it's particularly problematic for younger people is because they seem to be experiencing a kind of loneliness epidemic. I mean, many people are feeling this. I will say it's a little bit unclear how much stock we should put in some of these numbers and some of this research. For example, I recently read a study that said that millennials are the loneliest generation. And then a week later, I read another study that said Gen Z is the loneliest generation ever. So, okay, let's just assume that people are lonelier lately than they've been. And the question is technology causing that, or are other factors causing it? For example, like reductions in population size and sort of fracturing of the social contract that's been underway for a long time, since really the 70s or 80s. Reduction of these public spaces and interaction, like we're basically used to have bowling teams and religion, and now all that stuff has kind of gone away. And is technology like robots maybe going to come to the rescue? Are they causing the problem, or are they going to rescue us? Here's a quote from researcher Jean Twenge, a professor of psychology at San Diego University. She says, Gen Z spends less time with their friends face-to-face and more time online and on social media. As we know from decades of research, people who interact with others face-to-face are less likely to be lonely. Recent research suggests that those who spend more time on social media, in contrast, are more likely to be lonely. One of the things that's particularly troubling about digital age life is the way in which the AI, the robots and the computers can basically communicate with us, and they all seem to now pass the Turing test. You may recall that the Turing test was a test devised by Alan Turing to try to see whether or not a computer had entered the consciousness club. How would we know? And his test was, well, if it becomes a very proficient language user, such that you listen to it and you're like, I think that's a human, then he thought, oh, it's now emerged into the consciousness club. We have to give it all the rights and privileges of a conscious being. And then along came all these chatbots, and like all of these things can pass the Turing test pretty easily. So you can be talking to somebody online and it's an AI and you don't know. You could be talking to somebody on the phone and it's an AI and you don't know. And that stuff's getting better and better. What that means, though, is that when young people are reaching out and trying to make social contact, they may be having a completely fake experience with a fake, like, it's not even somebody who's catfishing you, pretending to be somebody else. It isn't even a person. And you might not understand that. So that's one problem of trust in the digital age. And then because a lot of our social interaction has gone online, you get the rise of what's called ghosting, where people will have these very intense sort of language relationships where you're talking online and sharing deep and meaningful stuff and feeling like you're forging a strong bond, and then the person just disappears completely. You get ghosted, and you can ghost others and never return to them. You never have to see them again. You never have to explain what you did or what you said or why you disappeared. And this phenomenon is very troubling. I think younger people in particular have to deal with a lot of this. So my first view on all this was kind of standard. I thought in order to be friends with somebody, it had to be a reciprocal relationship. It had to be kind of an embodied experience where you shared some kind of activity with them. Let's say you played music with them, or at camp you went canoeing with them, or you played chess. You did something with the person, and the feelings had to be sort of mutually reciprocal. This was my naive view of friendship. I suspect many of you share this view. And I thought then that any of these interactions with robots or computers would not be friendship. They wouldn't be forms of intimacy. They would be sham. They'd be sham friendships. They'd be fake. They wouldn't be real. Then I started to do a lot more research on the psychology of this and found that actually there's a lot of evidence that people report having beneficial relationships with non-reciprocal agents. In other words, people get into what we call parasocial relationships, where let's say there's a celebrity and they don't know that celebrity at all, but they follow that celebrity like on a weekly basis. And somehow, slowly, they begin to form a bond with that celebrity, and they feel very close to that celebrity. And when they interact with their images and their social networking, the person feels better. It improves their mood and releases a lot of sort of positive affect or positive emotion. So I began to think, oh, maybe you can have a kind of friendship without reciprocity. There's some sort of radical cases of this where a person bonds with an object. Like if you remember that movie with Tom Hanks called Castaway. He's on a desert island. He has no human beings to talk to. He's there for years, and he forms this strong bond with a volleyball, which he names Wilson. And he becomes emotionally entangled with Wilson, such that when Wilson sort of like gets separated from him, he's devastated. And you think about that and you think, well, that's just silly, but it isn't. Human beings are kind of suckers for anything with a face, and anything that basically like has a voice or is even cuddly. We can bond with it. And so there's something about human and mammal imprinting that really doesn't need reciprocity. It just needs some other sort of low bar for you to sort of bond with it. So one of the things we know about human beings and bonding is that, you know how after a baby's born, you know, in the old movies, you would basically pick the baby up and slap its butt and take it away. But now we know you need to put it onto the mother's body. You need that skin-on-skin contact because that releases a lot of really important neurochemicals and hormones and biochemistry. Oxytocin floods and endogenous opioids like endorphins flood the system. This is extremely important for bonding. Just like in the same way that human beings have like a fear system or like a lust system, you know, lust is a mammal system. It's basically a kind of set of neurochemicals and bodily hormonal drives that then push you towards certain kinds of behavior so you can procreate, so you can have sex and make other human beings. All mammals have basically the same system, the lust system. We also have a similar system that's basically about forging the kinds of nurturing bonds or care. In fact, the affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp calls this the care system. And it does produce a lot of oxytocin and endogenous opioids, and it's very important to have this sort of skin contact to trigger it. We saw during sort of the pandemic that people not only had like a kind of skin hunger where they felt very much like deprived of touch, but also a kind of face hunger where you couldn't see people's faces. They were all covered up and you couldn't see people smile and you couldn't see people like engage with each other and pass on those positive social emotions. So that is a very interesting issue about how human beings are pre-wired for bonding. There's a lot of evidence that this is the case because we know when it fails or it doesn't work. For example, very sad to say, in cases of war-torn regions where you have a lot of orphans, where they've lost their parents, and they may be raised in an orphanage where they have very little sort of contact with caregivers, after a couple of years of this, the child usually develops a kind of attachment disorder. They find it hard later in life to bond with people in general. And that's because what neuroscientists say is that ability to bond with others, it has to happen, it has to be triggered within the first 2 years of human life. That's sort of the window of opportunity for bonding. Once that's been stimulated, then you're going to have the ability to do it later in life. And we know that other mammals have this same system. For example, like sheep have a very narrow window of bonding opportunity because it's only like an hour. Once the baby's born, the mother licks the afterbirth off and nurses the baby, and they release all these biochemicals that locks them together as mother and baby, and that gives them a lifelong identification with each other. But if you take the baby away from the mother, this is terrible, but for over an hour and then reintroduce the baby, the mother sheep will reject the lamb. But you can inject oxytocin back into the mother and reintroduce the baby, and that oxytocin will facilitate bonding again. So it's kind of an amazing lock and key system for human bonding because we share this system with all other mammals. This system seems built to connect young offspring with their caregivers, their mothers, fathers, or siblings, aunts, uncles, alloparents. And it also basically is how we forge strong friendships. Now, what's so great about friendship? as if you needed to be told, it is still interesting to see the research on this. There's a wonderful Harvard study. It's been going for decades. And that study has found there's basically two main ingredients for people to be happy in life. One is meaningful work or hobby or something you can sort of creatively engage with on a daily or weekly basis. Doesn't matter what it is. Could be gardening, could be playing the piano, doesn't matter. And two is friendships. Strong friendships of some kind seem to be absolutely crucial for people in terms of their flourishing and their reported happiness. And we know that men on average live 12 years longer if they're married, and women live on average 7 years longer if they're married. So it's pretty clear that some kind of strong friendship like this is beneficial to our health. So there's a huge amount of sort of embodied interaction that seems really important for friendship. What happens when you take the body away and you have just a kind of digital interface? Well, what are the forms of digital interface? They also have different levels of embodiment. So if you're sending emails to people, that's a pretty low level of embodiment. It's just text and you're reading it. But still, it can forge connections between people. Then you think about like, a Zoom meeting or some kind of online FaceTime situation where you can see the person and you can see their emotions as they're talking and engaging, and you catch their emotions too, like a contagion. That's an increased form of embodied interaction, even though it's online. Then imagine like console playing, like you're playing a game with your friends. You're playing like Grand Theft Auto or something, or it's a sort of like capture the flag scenario, and you and your friends are basically connected through an audio device and you're using your controller. And I've watched my son and others do this, and their whole bodies get sort of immersed in it and drawn into it. They are jumping around in the room because they're kind of living through this virtual reality. So that's another level of embodiment, still digitally grounded, but much higher levels of embodiment than, say, email. And then I suppose the next step is the sort of virtual reality suit, the glasses, some kind of suit that you get into where you're actually engaging with somebody who's like, let's say in Japan, but the suit is responding to their touch and action over there in real time to you all the way over here in the United States. That's a kind of enhanced reality or virtual reality that people are now working on and are getting closer and closer to. So these are levels of embodiment that I think are interesting. And does it make friendship easier to happen? My old way of thinking was, yeah, the more embodiment, the better. However, it turns out if you think about email or that kind of interaction, it's no different from pen pals. And so people forged very strong relationships by sending letters to each other. It's all through human history. How is that possible? And I think the explanation is that language has a very unique ability to trigger the emotions in the hearer, in the listener. So the person who's telling the story can activate a kind of embodiment in the reader or the listener that's very real. It's not a sham or fake embodiment. You start to feel the emotions of the other person because language has this ability to actually trigger these pathways in the brain and the body, these emotional affective pathways. So when you hear a really good story from somebody, you actually start to feel, you catch again the contagion. So that leads me to a sort of a list of what it takes to be friends. And I'm curious what you think of this list. Here's a kind of list, a criteria of intimacy. First, you have the sort of shared experience I was talking about before. You sort of have to do something with somebody in order to sort of become friends with them. Two, it seems like at least you need some kind of intentionality connection. Like you need to know the other person's mind, that they have intentions and hopes and dreams. Understand what those hopes and dreams are so that you can take them on board and they can take your hopes and dreams on board and be concerned about them. So that means that other person has to have a mind. Three, you need all this positive emotion that I was talking about that's driven by oxytocin and endorphins. That stuff's got to be there. It has to feel good to forge a friendship with somebody. And then finally, you need something like loyalty. You need to be able to count on that person. So these are the things that I think sort of make up a friendship. And now here's the curious thing. Let's run this down. Human beings in a face-to-face interaction have all of those things. They have the shared experience, the intentionality, they have the good feelings of the oxytocin, and they have the sense of loyalty. But look at other ways of having friendships. Animals, for example, many of us think of them as friends. Now, you can't share the mind of an animal. I know you think you can, but your dog doesn't know what happened to you at work today with the reports that your boss was disappointed in. You can't tell your dog about the trouble you're having with your college degree. What happens instead, however, is the dog and you can have a strong bond with regard to all those feelings. Oxytocin and endorphins increase when you're petting your dog. There's a lot of evidence of this. And so you get all of that sort of warmth and that sort of chemical bonding that you get with a human being. You can get that with a dog and a cat and I don't know about a snail, but certainly other mammals. And you get great loyalty from dogs anyway. Cats, With online friends, however, you get the shared intentionality. You know they have a mind. You can talk to them about their mind and connect. You get a much more reduced embodied experience, but some kind of embodiment. And I think with online life, you get a very reduced loyalty because a lot of times it's anonymous and you may or may not see these people again, so the loyalty goes down, I think. Now, finally, with robots and AI, the question is, do you have any of these criteria? Do you have the shared mind interests? Do you have the feelings? Do you have the loyalty? And I think we can't say that the robot's mind is something that we've entered into and entangled with because it has none of its own interests if it's been programmed. But it certainly can help produce those feelings that we were talking about through touch and through conversation, where our own oxytocin and endorphins rise when we're around them. They can also be programmed to be loyal. So there's some sense in which that bonding can definitely happen with robots. It won't be the full-on friendship and intimacy, but maybe it's a good consolation for those who are experiencing loneliness. Finally, let me pose a kind of thought experiment to you. One thing that many younger people will say is that they have, 1,000 friends. And you ask them, like, what do you mean you have 1,000 friends? And they'll be like, well, on Facebook or on Instagram, I have 1,000 friends. But there's a very famous anthropologist named Robin Dunbar who pointed out that it's very hard for human beings to even keep track of a friend group that's larger than 100 or 150. And that's really a very large group of acquaintances that you have to sort of know a little bit about. It's sort of networking, I would say, professional networking. How many actual friends do you have? Much smaller group. You can count it on one hand, I think, in most cases. But what's interesting is ask a young person who thinks of like 1,000 people as their friends, how many people would bring them chicken soup tonight if they called up and said, hey, I'm really sick and I just need, some chicken soup to try to help me with my cold. Do you have a friend, not a family member, but a friend that would go and pick it up and bring it over to you? And the reason why this is kind of a fun thought experiment is that in our frictionless world of online friendships, going to the store, getting soup and bringing it to somebody, that costs something. That costs your friend something. That shows they're willing to burn calories for you and actually do something in the world, take time out, make a sacrifice, and sort of bring you something you need. And are you willing to do that for another person that you know? Because I think that changes and shows you what friendship requires in terms of an activity, not just a kind of online shared pleasure. What's hilarious about this thought experiment is whenever I ask a young person this question, they'll say this, well, why would I need a friend to bring me chicken soup? I can just call Grubhub or whatever it is and they'll bring it to me directly. So there's no need for the friends for that. That's all been automated. And that leads us all the way back to the beginning question, which is as life becomes more and more convenient and more sort of structured by AI, robotics, computers, will we be becoming more and more lonely, or will they actually come to the rescue and become our best friends and our lovers? Okay, that's enough to chew on for today. I hope you enjoyed this little foray into friendship and social robots. As always, subscribe, check out our Patreon page where we've got all kinds of goodies for people at different levels of Patreon, and always stay curious. I'll see you back here next time.
Hey, Curiosifers, Stephen Asmere. Just a quick note to say thank you for all the wonderful feedback we've been getting on this crazy little show we're making. We are having a ball making it. And it's good to get feedback, and keep the comments coming, and also suggestions about future show ideas. We're reading the comments and we are taking them seriously. Also, it's really hard to play the bass and talk at the same time. It makes me wonder how Sting does it. Point is this, we also have a Patreon page. Head on over to Patreon. There's a link on our sort of front page of YouTube. And see, there's different levels that you can support us, and you get bonus material at the different levels. And also, you get special access to crazy ideas and unusual knowledge. So please avail yourself of that possibility. In the meantime, thanks again, and we'll see you back here next time. And remember, always stay curious.